radar is well known to have played an important role in enabling the Allies to win World War II. It gave them the edge in battles. Radar was a key warning system that picked up approaching enemy aircraft, which enabled home defences to scramble and ward off incoming bombardments from the air. Did you know that Australian physicists helped to develop this technology during World War II? Victor Burgmann, a graduate of the University of Sydney, was one such physicist. As a new graduate in 1939, Victor was invited to join the CSIR, now called the CSIRO, to work on the emerging RDF technology, which was soon called radar. By 1940, Victor was in London, liaising with scientists and gathering as much information as possible on the technology for the Australian government, all while trying to stay alive during the Blitz. I'm historian and budding archivist, Dr. Gab Kemmis, and this is an episode of Speaking of History, a podcast which explores stories hidden within the recently digitised cassette tapes of interviews conducted in the 1970s, 1980s and 1990s with former University of Sydney staff and students. Victor Burgmann was born on the 5th of December 1916 in North Sydney, New South Wales. He was interviewed by university historian Ursula Bigot on the 21st of March 1980. Attending university was a given for Victor. Victor's father, Ernest Burgmann, was a university graduate, and Victor recalls that there was simply an unspoken expectation that he would also attend the University of Sydney. Let's listen to him reflect on how he ended up there. As the recording of the interview was not up to broadcast standards, an actor has been used in this episode to voice Victor Burgmann's words.
I don't recall any discussion about it. I did my leaving certificate. I did it twice because on the first round through I failed in Latin. I was actually picked out by the school inspector one day, and he read out the marks of this boy. 98 for chemistry, 95 for maths, and 2 for Latin. I felt terribly ashamed. Anyway, I failed in Latin, and I was supposed to be a doctor, you see. I don't know how this arose, but it was assumed. Of course, in any subject, once you start working at it, you get interested in it. And so Bob Davies, who is now the Bishop of Tasmania, and I worked very hard at Latin, and this ensured I passed Latin the second round. But during the vacation before going to university, my uncle, my father's brother, who had an engineering works in Newcastle, invited me to come down and, work a few weeks in his factory, which I did. And I enjoyed it enormously. So I became an engineer.
Unusually for the time, Victor graduated with a double degree in science and engineering. He graduated with his science degree majoring in physics in 1937 and graduated in 1939 with an engineering degree, specialising in mechanical and electrical engineering. In August of 1939, he was tapped on the shoulder by Professor John Madsen to join the CSIR's radiophysics department. World War II began just 1 month later, and by 1940, Victor was asked to go to London to work with scientists who were developing radar. He was to send relevant information back to Australia so that the technology could be installed to bolster Australia's defences. On reflection, Victor says he's surprised they asked such a raw graduate to fill such an important role. Victor had met his future wife Lorna Bradbury by this time, yet sadly for the young couple, they got to spend just 8 days together after their wedding before Victor boarded a ship bound for London. Victor recalls his departure from Sydney and leaving his young wife, unsurprisingly, with great sorrow.
I got married. I think it was 8 days before leaving for England. Sir John Madsen, of course, was, I think, chairman of the radiophysics department and had very great power in our land, and he and my wife got on fairly well, and he persuaded her, no, you couldn't go, it's only single men. And she said, but he's married. So I went off with us not really knowing when we would see each other again, and that, of course, was very sad for a young married bloke, and for her too, who was left behind. So after about a year, she really started applying pressure in being allowed to join me, and did succeed. She managed to sail to England in 1941.
Victor arrived in London at the height of the Blitz. The Blitz was the prolonged bombing of major cities in Britain by the German Air Force from September 1940 until May 1941. Ursula asked Victor if he was overwhelmed once he arrived in London.
It was only a couple of months after joining that the 3rd of September arrived and war was declared. and after less than a year working in that division, the position arose where an officer was required in London to act as the channel of communication of this material back to the Sydney laboratory. To my surprise, no, I wasn't surprised. I just took things as they came. No, as I say, I am rather an oblivious person. I just got on with it.
Victor threw himself into his work after arriving.
I was living in London House, which was quite a decent-sized sort of place. Of course, I arrived when the air raids were probably at their height. Well, we had an office in Australia House, and our job was to go out and visit operational units. Our principal job was visiting laboratories all over Britain who were doing work on RDF and factories in order that we could collect information directly relevant to Australia and get it out in one form or another to the Australian Radiophysics Laboratory. Sometimes, of course, we were anxious to get pieces of equipment.
After about 2 years in London, Victor was then asked to travel to Washington, D.C. to work with scientists at MIT, again on radar. Yet this time, his wife was permitted to join him.
The time had arrived where a representative was needed in Washington, so I was transferred to Washington. And that's an interesting voyage across the Atlantic in convoy at the peak of the submarine activity. We were thankful to arrive in New York. We had 10 months in America. After 4 months in Washington, I said to headquarters back in Sydney, "Look, this is only clerical work here. I want to go to one of the laboratories where the work is being done and work directly on the site of a laboratory." So they agreed to this, and I had the last 6 months at MIT in Boston. This was very much more to my liking.
Victor and his wife returned to Sydney in 1943. With the Allies on the front foot by 1945, the CSIR's radiophysics department began contemplating the post-war applications of radar. Victor talks glowingly of the research they conducted at the CSIR, calling it world-class.
Yes, I came back to radiophysics, and by 1945 the division was thinking of its post-war place in the scheme of things, and we were fortunate in that period to be under the leadership of Dr. Taffy Bowen, who was an imaginative leader and very soon developed 3 or 4 distinct areas in which the research should be directed. It was because of his imaginative approach and recognising what the radar technologies provided in research opportunities that the division has gone on and become a very important jewel in the crown of CSIRO. The particular area I ended up in was the application of radar techniques to the benefit of civil aviation, and I had a marvellous 5 years exploiting those techniques for the benefit of civil aviation, and I would say we were outstandingly successful.
Victor's interview gives us personal insights into what it was like for scientists working on the emerging technologies that went on to help the Allies win the war. It also reveals the perhaps lesser-known story of how radar was applied to great public benefit after the war ended, and the enduring legacy these post-war applications of wartime research continue to have in Australia. The Speaking of History podcast series is part of the History of University Life program. You can find out about our events by heading over to the History of University Life on Twitter handle @HULSeminar. The podcast is supported by the School of Humanities in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Sydney, with technical production by Peter Adams. This podcast was recorded on Gadigal country, and we pay our respects to elders past and present.